History as it happens, February 23rd, 2021. Understanding Fascism. The word fascism may immediately evoke thoughts of Nazism and Adolf Hitler, the epitome of evil. Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, they were fascist strongmen of the century past. But in America today, some people say they see signs of a fascist comeback. So it's time to ask, what is fascism? As we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I never call Donald Trump a fascist. Many people push me to do that. But I don't call him a fascist because I think that it's unhelpful.
Hello, everyone. More than 70 years after his death, it's still chilling to listen to Hitler's voice.
Dass ich mich in diesen Jahren für dich eingesetzt habe, dass ich anständig meine Zeit verwendet habe im Dienste meines Volkes. Gib du jetzt deine Stimme ab. Wenn ja, dann tritt für mich ein, so wie ich für dich eingetreten bin.
If you watch clips of his speeches, you'll see the masses cheering back, citizens of a culturally, economically, and scientifically advanced society leaping into the abyss. You see the emotive power of fascism to mobilize the masses by exalting loyalty to nation and race above the rights of the individual. Was fascism destroyed last century with the ends of Hitler and Mussolini, then Franco decades later? Or is it still alive as a viable political program, or as a movement on the fringes? Or is the word fascism used as a warning, a label to apply to those who seem dangerous? Or is it merely another insult to throw at your political opponents? We're going to speak to NYU historian Ruth Ben-Ghiat about these matters in a moment. For now, let's consider that every recent American president has been called a fascist by their critics, whether anti-war protesters or TV commentators.
This is fascism.
Media fascism.
It's very much a dictatorship. They're very much the fascists they keep calling us.
The ideology and the economic policy of fascism has always been on the left.
And the poor have been systematically looted in this country. The rich have been made richer under this criminal fascist president.
For a lot of people, calling Donald Trump a fascist was just ad hominem, a lazy political insult. It was the liberal who cried wolf. And yet, look what happened the moment he took office.
You know, I remember covering anti-war protests in New York City in 2004 outside the Republican National Convention. I saw posters of George W. Bush adorned with a Hitler mustache. Barack Obama was called both a fascist and a socialist, as if those terms are interchangeable, by some of his critics on the right. And Donald Trump has been called a fascist, a wannabe dictator, or the more general term, authoritarian. Now, some of Donald Trump's supporters are what you might call neo-fascists. Take the Proud Boys, for instance. They marched in support of Trump's efforts to overturn the election in Washington, D.C. recently.
Our streets! Our streets! Destroy the GOP! Destroy the GOP! Our streets! Our streets! Our streets! Donald Trump! Donald Trump!
And you may recall a presidential debate. Trump told the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by, the same debate where he sounded reluctant to condemn white supremacists.
Are you willing tonight to condemn white supremacists and militia groups and to say that they need to stand down and not add to the violence in a number of these cities, as we saw in Kenosha and as we've seen in Portland?
Sure,
Are you
I'm
prepared
willing
to
do
specifically
that,
do it? Well, go ahead, sir.
I would say almost everything I see is from the left wing, not from the right wing.
So what are you saying?
I'm willing to do anything. I want to see peace.
Then do it, sir.
Say it. Do it. Say it. Do you want to call him? What do you want to call him? Give me a name. Give me a
white
name.
Supremacists and
who would
right
you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and right
Proud Boys. Stand back and stand by. But I'll tell you what. Somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left, because this is not a right-wing problem. This is a left-wing. This is a left-wing problem.
We've already dedicated an episode of this podcast to understanding socialism. Well, now it's time to arrive at a sound definition of fascism and what it means to be a fascist or to be called a fascist in the 21st century. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is a historian at NYU, and she's the author of Strongmen, From Mussolini to the Present. She appeared very frequently in TV interviews during the Trump presidency when his norm-shattering ways led to fears the U.S. was sliding into authoritarianism. Ruth, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Glad to be here.
I'd like to get into the broader subject of authoritarianism at some point, but let's start with fascism. How do you define it?
So this is one of these words that famously some people say is not very definable. And indeed, Mussolini, the creator of fascism, avoided defining it for many, many years. But it is a hyper-nationalist, imperialist, right-wing dictatorship. Starts out as a movement, becomes a dictatorship with racial ideologies. And Mussolini defined it, he called it early on a, quote, revolution of reaction. And I think that this sums up a lot of the contradictions in fascism, because it took from the left. Mussolini had been a socialist years before, and he talked about revolution, liberating Italy from its humiliation, and victimhood is important. And then, of course, it became a reactionary movement that took away rights of workers, imprisoned leftists, and many others.
Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, Francisco Franco, who else might we place into that category of fascism from the 20th century?
I think in terms of people who governed, those are the main, regimes, right? And Franco did his best. He's an interesting case of someone who he came in at the close of the Civil War in 1939 and was allied with the fascists and identified with fascist ideology, and then got himself rehabilitated in the Cold War and hired American PR firms to get the taint of fascism off of him. But there were many, many fascist movements that didn't succeed in taking power all over Europe. And indeed, outside of Europe, Mussolini had imitators in Japan and in many other places around the world. Hitler had imitators in India. But those are the main regimes, with Mussolini being the first and the one who established the template of fascism.
I'm thinking of the Iron Cross in Austria after listening to your comments as well as a fascist movement. Did fascism die in the 20th century, or is it still around today?
So it's what I wanted to do in my book, Strongmen, which, with the exception of Gaddafi in Libya, who was a socialist, but he's there because of his links with Mussolini and his links with Berlusconi, I cover right-wing authoritarians precisely because I wanted to show the through line through 100 years of what happens to these ideologies and these techniques, including personality cults and survivalist ideologies, after fascism perishes in 1945. And so what you see is this kind of dispersal of fascists who, many of them, neo-fascists, neo-Nazis, went to Franco's Spain. They were protected by Franco. And then when Franco passed on, or even for some before that, they spread out to Latin America, South America, and to Chile. So I have Pinochet in Chile, military coup in 1973 in the book. And there was a German community of neo-Nazis already existing, and they became energized when Pinochet came in. And so fascistic ideologies of Marxism as a cancer, of the right of the state to stamp out Marxism, misogyny, militarism, the whole cocktail of things that made fascism continues in other regimes. And so do neo-fascists and neo-Nazis who found refuge, found a haven in those right-wing regimes.
And German fascism, among other forms of fascism, was obsessed with race and war, national conquest, correct?
Yeah, and so those are two very good things to isolate. So if we take the racial dimension, the worries about demographics, about usually white Christians being, quote, overwhelmed or submerged by peoples of color who are more fertile, who might take over. This goes back to Mussolini, actually. Long before Hitler came in, Mussolini in the 1920s was worrying aloud about Italians not having enough babies. And he said, the cradles are empty, the cemeteries are full, and, quote, yellow and brown people are at the doors. And you see this if we only need to think about, right-wing rulers who are very concerned with demographics in America and especially in Europe, such as Orban. It's almost an exact match, their demographic rhetoric, which takes on a racial cast and justifies racist policies. So this is a continuity, an inheritance of fascism that informs authoritarian governments today.
Grievance politics, correct? Mass politics, populism, all part of fascism.
Very much so. And I always say, if you see a politician and you wonder whether they are going to be a strongman on the rise, look to see if they engage in grievance politics and the rhetoric of victimhood, both saying that their nation is victimized by, could be the EU, it could back when it was the League of Nations, or threatened demographically or threatened by other kinds of enemies. So this grievance politics, which then places the person using it as a savior. I'm going to save you from this humiliation. I'm going to save the nation from these threats. And these go together, and they are a through line of 100 years of authoritarianism. And it's a very, very effective way to mobilize people by playing on their anxieties. And so one of the recurrences that I track in the book, which is a very fundamental question of what circumstances have to be there for men like Mussolini and Hitler, all the way up to Orban or Putin or Trump, what circumstances favor these types of individuals and this use of this rhetoric. And one thing we see is often these kinds of figures appeal when a society has gone through a lot of social change quickly, particular social progress. It could be, and it depends, what that means, what the threats mean in each time and place. But the commonalities are, it could be secularization, could be racial emancipation, it could be gender emancipation. So in Spain, in the 1930s, before the coup of Franco, women won a lot of legal rights they hadn't had before. You also had a leftist government, so there was a lot of emancipation of workers. So when those conditions are there, this kind of anxiety that it sets off makes people very receptive to grievance politics, that you are threatened by this, but we will save you.
I'm not as familiar with Mussolini's reign as I am with Hitler's, based on my reading choices over the years. In Nazi Germany, many people who had no use for Nazism's finer points, so to speak, still admired the person of Hitler because he made them feel proud to be German again, right?
Well, this is where cults of personality come in, and they're very, very fundamental. Many of the strongmen who have the most success came to power either with a background in some kind of mass communications. So they really knew how to speak to people. They knew how to touch people emotionally. Hitler, even in the 1920s, when he took hypnosis lessons, he took voice lessons, he practiced his gestures in front of the mirror, all the better to rouse people emotionally and psychologically and make a bond with them. And once that happens, the figure goes on to dominate the party. And then you have this kind of authoritarian leader-follower relationship, which is really fundamental. And they become the savior, and all of the disparate things we've been talking about, like the grievance politics, the sense of being victimized, it makes sense because the leader is going to fix it. One reason I wrote Strongmen is having my background in studying fascism and propaganda. When Donald Trump started to use these phrases such as, I will fix it, I am your voice, it seemed very familiar to me. It was his way of connecting emotionally with Americans who felt anxious, who felt displaced. And I recognized that as part of a pattern that could be very successful for him.
The perfect segue to start talking about the present moment. But a final point about the communication skills and charisma of strongmen. When I was preparing for this podcast, I watched some of Hitler's speeches, and he was a mesmerizing speaker. Don't mean that as a compliment, of course. But he had arenas filled with people who probably all thought they were sane and sensible, patriotic Germans, all shouting back at him with a Sieg Heil. He was in a frenzy. It was disturbing, really.
Well, yes, and one very significant fact about this is early on, so Hitler was lucky enough to have Goebbels, Joseph Goebbels, who became his minister of propaganda, but was with him from the mid-20s. So Hitler was unusual among strongmen in that most of them are hiring and firing people constantly. It's like, revolving door. Hitler had more or less the same group of collaborators from very early on. So what Goebbels found is that when he took Hitler into the studio, and this was already in the 1920s, so Hitler is very frustrated, his putsch didn't work, he went to jail, he comes out, and he's very frustrated that he can't do what Mussolini's already done, right? So Goebbels takes him into the studio to record speeches, and he finds that Hitler is wooden. He's a terrible speaker in the studio. What makes Hitler come alive is the crowd, is the call and response, is being able to directly address in his very unusual screaming fashion. And many people have studied his speeches that started out fairly calmly, and then they would get more and more frenzied, as you say. And this emotion was highly effective because this goes back to the grievance politics, because Germans felt that he was feeling for them. He was taking unto himself the pain and the sorrow of the whole German nation. And so people would say, I didn't even know I felt this way until he spoke to me. And they felt personally addressed by Hitler because of the emotion. And Mussolini did this too. He didn't scream as much. He used gesticulation, and he had this like crazy gaze that was very penetrating. They all have their ways of doing it. But that's very significant that Hitler needed the energy of the crowd. Goebbels said he was the most boring speaker in the studio possible, like wooden.
That's interesting. I'd never heard that story before. So
that's part of my research for the book. I found that out. Yeah.
Excellent. So, Donald Trump. When you're in the moment, as we are now, a time of hyper-partisanship in the United States, and when you get into terms such as authoritarian or fascist, and you're talking about the President of the United States, well, first I should ask you, how do you describe Donald Trump? And second, do you receive pushback from people who feel those kinds of political terms should be reserved for 20th century dictators and not the President?
Mm-hmm. So although I've spent years studying fascism, or I should say because I've spent years studying fascism, I never call Donald Trump a fascist. Many people push me to do that. But I don't call him a fascist because I think that it's unhelpful. So certain things that come from fascism, like personality cults, many of the things we've been talking about, obsession with demography, grievance politics, they date from fascism. But to call him a fascist evokes a one-party state that, except for North Korea and China, this isn't how authoritarianism works today. I do see Trump as a person of authoritarian inclinations. And I saw this very early. And because I felt that this was the lens you needed to see his actions and his aspirations, the way that he was able to domesticate the GOP, the politics of threat and fear, when during the first impeachment trial, when Senator Sherrod Brown interviewed his colleagues and asked them why they voted to acquit, and they all said that they were afraid. And so these dynamics, I'm interested in processes and dynamics, right? And they changed under Trump, and I believe they changed in an authoritarian direction. Now, another reason I wrote the book, and it's not a very long book, but it goes over a long period of time, over 100 years, because I felt that people need to see how authoritarianism evolves. So one-party states, today they come in through elections, and you manipulate elections to stay there. That's what Erdogan has done and what Putin has done. You don't have to have, there was a military coup in Myanmar recently, but they're very rare today, comparatively rare. And fascist-style takeovers and dictatorships are more rare. So we have to understand how authoritarianism works today and not necessarily label somebody a fascist, because otherwise people say, well, what are you talking about? You're not in jail. Here you are on TV criticizing the president. If this were fascism, you wouldn't be able to do that. And that's correct.
That is
That's
right.
totally correct. Yeah. And so it leads to a kind of distortion. And that's why I don't use that term.
So let's use your term authoritarian inclinations and take the January 6th mob attack on the U.S. Capitol and the legitimation of violence for political ends. I think the most damning fact to come out of that fiasco, according to news reports, is that after the mob had assaulted the Capitol, President Trump was on the phone with the House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who was pleading with Trump to do something to call off the mob. And instead, according to news reports, Donald Trump sided with the mob instead of Congress.
Yeah, and connecting to what we were saying before about the leader-follower relationship, it's really important that although he legitimized extremism, and what these figures do is they come on the scene and they give focus and legitimation to existing extremists, subversives, anti-democratic tendencies. And the leader cult gives it a focus. And what Trump added, because the GOP was already going in this direction, we already had anti-government militias, we already had all these things, but he gave it a presidential approval and imprimatur. He was signaling to these people. So it's very important that at the rally that preceded the assault, it wasn't just that he incited violence. He said, we have to go fight and take back. He said, I love you. You're very special. And our journey together is just beginning. So this goes back to what we were saying about Hitler and the emotional connection. To tell them he loved them means, because I see January 6th as actually a kind of leader cult operation. They were rescuing their beleaguered leader who, in their view, if they really did believe that the election was stolen, they were getting him out of an unjust situation. They were rescuing the heroic leader. And so the elevation of his followers by telling them that he loves them right before he's inciting them to do violence, it's very important, and it goes back to fascism. Right.
It's remarkable through history to see strongmen who did great harm to their own people on the right and left retain the admiration of many of their people. Even now, Stalin, for instance, is making a comeback as a state builder of sorts in the worldview of Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, and that's very tragic. All of these dynamics, which we've been talking about right-wing authoritarianism, but the 1920s, which is when a lot of these things were experimented, it was equally done by the left, and left-wing dictators and authoritarians caused more deaths globally. So I chose to have this through line about right-wing authoritarians, just because that's more my specialization. Mm-hmm. But this is a playbook that is extreme right and extreme left, and that's very clear. And there are people like, had I broadened my focus, but then it would have been like a kind of catalog. You could have included Castro, you could have included Chavez. These figures also use the same playbook.
Mm-hmm. One reason why I like speaking to historians about these issues is you can step away from the daily news cycle and at least try to look at these matters dispassionately. And last year, before the election, many intellectuals believed that if Donald Trump had won a second term, people who believe they weren't being hyperbolic, they thought that if he had won another term, our democracy would have been in real trouble. Where did you stand in that discussion?
So picking up what I was saying before about how authoritarianism works today, it's more of a continuum. And it's not like a coup where, you go to school or work, because coups happen in the morning usually, and you're in a democracy, and then you come home, or you don't come home at all because you're in jail, and you're no longer in a democracy. It's like a sliding scale. It's gradual, right? So it took Putin 20 years to get so that he doesn't have to, he can now stay in office for like 15 more years. So there's no doubt in my mind that had Trump won a second term, the things that he was setting up with William Barr, for example, at the Department of Justice, the trajectories were very clear to me that protests would have been criminalized to a greater degree. Protesters would have been called terrorists. They were setting up, I was following all of these trajectories out. And there would have been far more pressure on the media because, again, for every Putin who has murdered journalists and poisoned people, there's an Orban who has domesticated almost all of the Hungarian press without using much violence. There's a lot of threat, and we don't hear enough about that. There's a lot of threats of fabricating charges of tax evasion, and this is like using these kinds of techniques is very common. So the U.S. would have become a far more restrictive place for, and more people would have become targets of the state, including people who speak out.
So, Ruth, why do you think it's important for Americans to have a sound understanding of these terms? Socialism, fascism, authoritarianism. Because, at least to my eyes, American politics has been characterized by conservatism and liberalism, Republican and Democrats. Not that we haven't had extreme right and extreme left movements, but the notion that our politics are plagued by would-be socialists and would-be fascists would indicate things have really gone astray, or maybe I just watch too much cable news. I don't know. I try not to watch too much cable news.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because, for example, you always have to ask, why is this discourse of polarization being circulated? Who is gaining? So one of the things that polarization requires is that there be no center anymore. So old style conservatism, liberalism, these are the terms you used, and we're not hearing as much about those, certainly from Fox News, et cetera, where, for example, I can get labeled as a, quote, radical left person. I am a pro-military liberal and progressive, socially progressive, but in no stretch of any imagination am I a radical leftist. But even Nancy Pelosi with Chanel jackets and pearls gets labeled a radical leftist. And Biden, this is absurd.
You're a professor at a prestigious university. That places you in a category in and of itself, I guess, right?
Yeah, but the purpose of that is to inflame the passions and to make people fearful that, for example, Biden's election would mean socialist apocalypse.
Right. And to discredit your ideas as well.
Yes, and so that people don't listen to you. But it's a politics of fear, making the center and liberal Democrats disappear into the left. And I've been very disturbed that there's so much commentary about the left, because in our country, we've had a left, but it's nothing compared to the left of many other countries. On the other hand, what has happened is the far right has been greatly legitimated under Donald Trump's presidency. They're much more emboldened. And the GOP itself has shifted way further to the right, so much so that Republicans who believe firmly in the rule of law, like the late John McCain or Mitt Romney, they are outliers now, and they are ridiculed.
Liz Cheney.
We are in a period where the Republican Party is moving toward, I think, an authoritarian political culture. And what I mean by that is there's no longer the democratic principle with a small d of mutual tolerance, for example, so that if you're a political opponent, you should be locked up. If you're a journalist, you should be locked up. And these are not concepts. And this was Trump's slogans were heralding this shift. And then they got adopted. And part of them were already there from the Tea Party. So he didn't invent a lot of these things. He just souped it up and accelerated it.
There's a story from the early days of the modern conservative movement when the great William F. Buckley kept the John Birch Society at the margins. And if you compare that to the situation today where a member or an adherent of the QAnon cult ran for Congress as a Republican in Georgia and won, that shows you how things have changed.
Yeah, so there's been some comparative politics studies that have come out in the last years that look at the GOP in the context of global parties, dispassionately looking at platforms and rhetoric, economic proposals. There's one by Pippa Norris at Harvard, has a large scale. These are big data-driven projects. And unfortunately, what they find is the GOP now doesn't line up anymore with conservative parties, either in England or in Germany. It lines up with far-right parties.
Yeah, all European conservative parties embrace the science of climate change, as far as I know.
Having people who believe in conspiracy theories, which recycle tropes from anti-Semitism and the kind of paranoid thinking, often subversive anti-government. It's very painful to me as someone who, loves America, I'm first generation, to have people who are allying with anti-government militias, like part of the crowd that came on January 6th. This is treasonous. These people want to explode the state. That is not being patriotic. That is not being a freedom fighter in any patriotic way. But that's where we are. And I've been very concerned that the representatives of these groups like Marjorie Taylor Greene are now in Congress, because once they enter into the lawmaking body, it's very difficult to stop the spread further.
The middle ground in U.S. politics does seem to be disappearing. Ruth Ben-Ghiat of NYU, thank you for a great conversation. On the next episode of History as It Happens, some people blame the news media for the hyper-polarized state of politics in our land and for spreading all kinds of misinformation and partisan hackery.
Yesterday, I announced on this program that I was going to commit public suicide. Admittedly, an act of madness. Well, I'll tell you what happened. I just ran out of bullshit.
The future of the press, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.